Okay, so I'll still keep that electronics question pending because there's a lot of statistics today that's coming up. So there's still one question pending from the third lecture. Okay, I'll start with this set now. Okay, so a certain op amp has an open loop gain of 10 to the power of 5. Okay, it has an open loop gain of about 10 to the power of 5. If the feedback factor is 0.1, the closed loop gain is how much? Okay, so first what you need to know is you need to know the relation between your closed loop gain and the open loop gain. Okay, so this is your open loop gain. This is your closed loop gain. So basically when you're saying closed loop gain, you're looking at the gain with feedback. Okay, so the loop is closed, the circuit is closed, and there's a output that's been fed back into the input. So here you have AVF is equal to AV divided by 1 plus beta AV. Okay, so this is the formula that you've derived in your first sem electronics class. Now what we're going to do is we're going to just put 10 in the power of 5 and 1 plus 0.1 into your 10 to the power of 5, which gives you approximately 9.99. Okay, something of that sort. Now, the thing is that if your gain is tending, your closed loop gain is basically tending to infinity, or if it's a high value, okay, if it's a very high value, then what you end up doing is you cancel these two things out by approximating this. Okay, so 1 plus beta AV is going to be beta AV. Okay, so you're approximating this term, so you end up having a beta AV. And then you cancel this out. So the only thing that it would depend on is your feedback factor. So what you do is you basically end up getting something around 10. Okay, so this is the exact formula and this is an approximation that you've done. Okay, so based on the options, you use which one you like. Okay, so now let's look at all the options. So we just did this. Okay, they've used the approximated formula, so it's 10. Okay, so if you need the exact closed loop gain, you end up using AVF is equal to AV divided by 1 plus AV beta and do the calculations like that. Or if you need the approximate closed loop gain, which is used when your gain is very high or when your gain starts tending to infinity, then you end up using your closed loop, approximate closed loop gain, which is given by 1 by beta. Okay, so let's move to the next question. Which of the following devices is used for the measurement of low pressure below atmospheric pressure? Now, you start to think whether this is even related to physics, but I think we've done this experimental techniques in physics paper in the second semester, so it's kind of like from there. Okay, so these are the different gauges that you have. I'm sure that you must have learned about the Pirani gauge and the Penning gauge, which is also your ionization gauge. So let's just move through all these terminologies quickly. Okay, so here there's kind of like an ambiguity because here they've said measurement of low pressure below atmospheric pressure. So when you're looking at this, you find out that the Pirani gauge and the ionization gauge end up giving you values, or end up helping you measure the pressure below the atmospheric pressure. So both of them, this is about, I think, 1 to 10 to the power of -3 torr, and this I think is about 10 to the power of -3 to 10 to the power of -5, I think, so much of torr. So torr is basically 1 mm of Hg, 1 mm of your mercury. Okay, and basically, why do you use these devices for measurement? So what you're basically doing is you're measuring the vacuum, and the only way to measure the vacuum is to actually measure the pressure, because you can't just measure the vacuum like that. Okay, so the way you measure the vacuum is basically looking at the pressure. Okay, so let's look at what a strain gauge means. Okay, a strain gauge is basically a device which is used to measure strain on an object. Okay, so it's nothing related to looking at the pressure, but it measures the strain of an object. Okay, so as the object is deformed, the foil is deformed, which causes an electrical resistance to change. So the resistance change, this resistance change is basically measured using your Wheatstone's bridge. and it is related to the strain by this quantity called the gauge factor, which we will be talking about in another question. Okay, so basically it's the change in resistance due to some deformation or a strain. Okay, next let's look at what a compound gauge means. Okay, so in this case what's happening is you can measure both positive as well as negative vacuum. Okay, so some cases if you end up instead of putting a compound gauge, if you end up putting a normal gauge, you might end up spoiling the device if you need to measure both positive as well as negative gauges. So this is what you use in those kind of situations. Okay, so these can measure both positive as well as negative vacuum pressures. Okay, so now let's look at the Pirani gauge. Okay, so the Pirani gauge is basically going to be measuring about 1 to about 10 to the power minus 3 torr. And these are a group of indirect pressure measuring gauges. Okay, now what they do is basically they use the property of your thermal conductivity of your gas, and that's how they measure the pressure. I'm not going too much into the details of it because we've done it, the second semester students have done it very recently. So basically the range is what you have to keep in mind. Okay, here. Now the other one is your ionization gauge, which is basically a device that measures basically a device that measures using the hotness of your filament. Okay, so there's going to be a filament in that gauge, and based on that and looking at the number of particles in that area that react with it, that's how it's going to tell you about the pressure. So now look at this one's torr. So basically the pressure is from something like 10 to the power minus 3 torr to 10 to the power minus 10 torr, which is like the range in which you can measure the pressures. Okay, so now what they've done is basically they've taken the pressure that's very closest to the atmospheric pressure. So we look at 1 atmosphere, it's basically around something like 760 mm of mercury. So that's like 760 torr. Okay, so they've taken this one which is closest to the atmospheric pressure. Okay, so you could probably challenge this question and say that's not the way it is. There are two answers, but that's how they've done it. Okay, so I'm trying to like create a logical basis for something that's there is no logical basis. Okay, so let's look at what you have. You basically have your Pirani gauge. It's your option D. Okay, so this is 1 atmospheric pressure is 760 mm of Hg. So you end up having 760 torr and you have 1.013 into 10 to the power of 5 pascals. Okay, so now I told you I would discuss about the gauge factor, which is basically related to the strain gauge. Okay, so what was it? It was basically taking the change in resistance with respect to your strain. Okay, so these are the different options that are given to you. Okay, and now what do we do? It's basically some definition that you have. Okay, so your strain gauge, strain factor, or your gauge factor here is basically the ratio of the relative change in your electrical resistance. So that's basically delta R divided by R, relative change. Okay, not just taking delta R, not just taking the change in your electric resistance, but relative change, because this is how your relative change is defined, to the mechanical strain, which is written as delta L divided by L. Okay, so now let's go to this. Okay, the gauge factor here is defined as delta R by R divided by delta L by L. So this is basically your strain, delta L by L, and you have your absolute change in your length, your original length that you have. Okay, there should have been an L naught here. And now what is this? This is the change in strain gauge resistance due to your axial strain and your lateral strain. And this is the unstrained resistance of your strain gauge, your R. Okay, so now here this is a little confusing because you start to think about this term rather than what they've said here. Okay, so let's just be careful about where to like actually be focused on, and I think you will kind of like figure it out once you kind of like look at the options. Okay, so here they've said a linear displacement transducer digital normally uses straight binary code, BCD, gray code, and hexadecimal code. So the thing here is that why do you use basically, let me just ask you this. So which of these is like easier to use in a digital system? Okay, So that's what you're going to be looking at. So in a digital system, which one is easier to use? So basically you would look at something that ends up giving you small, like the minimum number of bit shifts, okay? So, and that is basically BCD, sorry, your gray code, okay? So that is basically gray code. So gray code is a code where you have only one change bit, okay? Only one changed bit is what you have in your gray code. So the number of shifts that are required are very less, okay? So that's why it's more useful in measuring these digital, all these digital measurements and you know, the way you see it, the outputs that are written in your digital form, those kind of things. Okay, so that's how you use your gray code. Now, let me just talk a little bit about your straight binary code, because I think you know, it's a very easy thing, but many of us don't remember it. Okay, so if I want to convert this 13 into a binary number, what do I basically do? I take 13 and divide it by 2. Okay, so I end up getting 6, and then I end up getting 1. And then I take this and I divide it by 2, I get a 3, and my remainder is 0. Okay, so I take this, I divide it by 2, I end up getting a 1, and my remainder is 1. So I write my binary number this way. Okay, starting from here up, 1 1 0 1. Okay, so now let's split it up. Okay, so your 2 power 0 is basically here. Okay, and this is switched on. 2 power 1 is switched off, 2 power 2 is switched on, and 2 power 3 is switched on. So you end up getting 8 plus 4 plus 0 plus 1. So that's basically going to give you 13. Okay, so I've worked it both ways for you. Now, what is your binary coded decimal? Okay, so let's look at BCD and how it looks. So basically, what we're doing here is we're going to be writing this BCD as 4 bits. Okay, so you end up having, if you have, okay, that's 4 places. Now if you have something like 13, okay, how do you write it in BCD? So you take this 1 and you write it as a 4-bit binary number. Okay, you write it in 4-bit binary, you take the 3 and you write it in 4-bit binary. Okay, and then what you end up seeing is, so let's write 3. So you have 1 1 0 0. Okay, that's your 3, and then you take this and you have 1 0 0 0. So that's your binary coded decimal. Okay, so what you're doing here is you're taking this 3, you're writing it in a binary form. It's basically 4 bits, and then you write it down here, and then you take this 1 and you write it in terms of a binary number. So I've taken a little bit more easier example. You could probably try doing it for 26 or something. So let's just try that. Okay, so now here, what do I have? I have a 6, I have a 2. So let me just see what I get using my binary. So I get 13, no remainder, so that's a 0. Then I do a 2. So what do I, okay, so basically what you're supposed to be doing is, okay, so you're supposed to be looking at 6, not the entire thing. Okay, so I've made a mistake here. What you're supposed to be doing is you're supposed to be splitting each digit and then writing the binary. Okay, so let me do a 2. So that gives me a 3 here, and I get a 0. I do a 2 again, that gives me a 1. My remainder is 1. Okay, what do I get here? I get 0 1 1 0. Okay, so 1 1 0, and I put a 0 here. So 0 1 1 0 is what I get, and now I have to write my 2. Okay, so what do I do for that? I end up writing 0 1 0 0. So this is how I write my binary coded decimal. Okay, next what you have is your gray code. Okay, so in your gray code, it has to have only 1 bit change from the previous one to the next one. Okay, so when I'm writing my gray code, there are a few ways to kind of like change from binary to gray code and gray code to binary, which I will be discussing. And then I will just show you how your hexadecimal looks like. Okay, so this is just to like kind of like recap what you've done in your first SEM electronics. So here you have your straight binary code, which is a normal binary. you've got your binary coded decimals. So you end up having basically each one of these have a couple of place values, and this is also called your 8, 4, 2, 1 because the weights are here 8, 4, 2, and 1. Okay, so those are the positional weights. And now there are some invalid binary coded decimals. So if you look at 4 bits, what's going to happen is it's going to basically, let's say it's going to take from 0 to 9, okay? And then your 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 end up being invalid binary coded decimals. Okay, these are invalid BCDs. Okay, you can only have it from 0 to 9. All the rest of them are invalid. Okay, because if you look at them too, you will kind of like realize, so if I write 0 and 1, you're supposed to be splitting it up and writing it in terms of 4 things, right? So you end up having 0, 0, 0, 1, and here you end up having 0, 0, 0, 0. Okay, so let's just remove that. So this is how you basically convert from your decimal to your binary coded decimal. Okay, so now let's go to the next thing. Okay, so now let's look at gray code. Okay, so gray code is basically where 2 successive values differ only in 1 bit. Okay, binary number is converted to a gray code by reducing switching operation. Because you're reducing switching operation, these are highly used in digital systems. Okay, so that's why we've got this as option C. Okay, so in your question, basically that's the part, but I think it's good to know about these binary code decimals because they're very easy to learn. Okay, and you don't have to put much effort for them. So here they've said a linear displacement transducer digital normally uses straight binary code, BCD, gray code, or hexadecimal code. It's basically gray code because the number of switching positions are lesser. Okay, the switching operations are lesser. Now, what do you have? Okay, so let's look at the applications of your gray codes. So gray codes are useful in analog, where analog information is converted into digital information, and it's also used in error correction. Okay, so next let's look at this. Okay, so how do you convert a binary to a gray code and a gray code to a binary? Okay, so let's take some random binary number which says 1010. Okay, so now I basically think of binary to gray as top curves because of the way it's kind of like done, and gray code to binary as oblique lines. Okay, again because of the way it's done, and I'll show you why. Okay, so this is binary to gray code. Okay, I want to change from binary to gray code, so basically I'm going to remember this thing called top curves for that. Okay, so if I want to change this into gray code, what I do is basically I write one exactly as it is. So this is called the MSB, which is the most significant bit, and this is called the LSB, which is the least significant bit. Okay, so MSB and LSB. So I take the MSB and write it as such. And then what I do is I take this 1 and 0 and I add it up and I get a 1. I take this 0 and 1 and I add it up and I get 1 again. And then I add this up too and I end up getting a 1. Now what you're supposed to remember is if this were a 1, you would neglect your carry. So if you take 1 and 1 and you add it up, you end up getting 0 and then there's a carry over 1. So neglect that carry and just write it as 0. Okay, so let's go back to the normal thing that we were doing, 1 0 1 0. Okay, so you take your MSB, put it down as such. Then what do? You take this and you add it to this. So that's why I keep saying top curves. Okay, so top curves are basically from binary to gray code. Gray code to binary are oblique lines. Okay, so here from 1 to 0 you end up getting a 1, 0 to 1 you end up getting a 1, 1 to 0 you end up getting a 1. Okay, so this is your gray code for 1 0 1 0. Now you want to convert from gray code to binary. So let's do that by taking this gray code itself. So I've taken this gray code form. Okay, I'm taking my answer and I'm going to be checking if it is going to give me this. So the first one, what I do is I take that down and I put it exactly where it is. So the MSBs do not change if it is binary or gray code. That's something that you should note. Okay, now what do? I take this one, I add it up to this and try to get a value. So what do I look at? I'm taking 1 and 1, I get a 0 and I get a carry 1. So I neglect the carry and I write 0. Then I take 0 and 1, what do I get? I get a 1. Then I take 1 and 1 and I end up getting a 0. So you know that you kind of like verified it both ways. So this is going to be giving my binary. Okay. So the reason I say this as oblique lines is because you basically add the oblique lines, and basically what you do here is you adding the top curves. Okay. So that's how I remember it. This is not there in any book. That's just something that I used to remember for gray code and binary. Okay. So here, let's look at this hexadecimal. Okay, so there's a base 16 here. What happens is this from 0 to 9 and from 10 to 15, what's going to happen is they're going to be writing as A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. So basically, this is extensively used in microprocessor programming. So you end up getting a couple of hexadecimal codes, and then you have to do all sorts of manipulations with them. The memory is written that way and things like that. So let's not go into that. Now let's move on to the next question. I think I've taken a lot of time in this one. Okay. So now this, okay, so one thing that you know about the GM counter is that it has this disadvantage, okay? So if your beta particle comes into it, or if your gamma particle comes into it, the only thing that your GM counter will do is just record the counts. It will not differentiate the energy. Whatever amount of energy it comes, it does not look at that. It will just keep on counting. Okay, so there's this disadvantage to the GM counter. Now let's look at this. Okay, so what is the GM counter? Okay, so is it energy selective? Is it a non-energy selective? Is it a scintillation detector? Is it a semiconductor detector? Okay, so these two things you can basically rule out because these are different kinds of detectors, not a GM counter. GM counter itself is a detector. Okay, so there's no technique of scintillations involved in it. There's no semiconductors involved in it. So you can rule out those two options. Next one, is it energy selective? So I just told you that if a beta particle comes into it or a gamma particle comes into it, it will not differentiate, it will just count. Okay, so it is not energy selective, it is non-energy selective. So let's just read about the other things. If you're taking the nuclear elective, you'll study about these two things in real detail. Okay, so okay, so in Geiger-Müller counter, the energies cannot be measured as it has a lack of differentiating abilities. So it is non-energy selective. Okay. Now let's look at a scintillation detector. So scintillations is basically when something strikes it, it produces a light. Okay. So let's look at this. A scintillation detector is obtained when scintillation is coupled to an electronic light sensor, like a photomultiplier tube. So you'll be, I think this is there extensively in the general paper in the third sem. Okay, so basically you'll have to draw these scintillation detectors and you know, like kind of like explain the whole process and how the scintillation is happening and things like that. So the photomultiplier tubes are basically used to kind of like increase the you know, increase the amount of electrons that are being put onto your detector. Okay, so that you get a better reading. Okay, so they emit and then they re-emit in the form of electrons via a photoelectric effect, and the multiplication results in an electric pulse. So that's just what I said right now. Now, what is your semiconductor detector? Basically, it's a detector that uses a semiconductor. And based on how the charged particles incident, it produces certain photons that, again, you know, connected to your detector, you can detect that energy level. Okay, so now let's look at this. Okay, so a random noise generator produces a signal. Okay, so this is whose amplitude varies randomly, which has no periodic frequency, which is unpredicted power spectrum, all of the above. So now I'll just explain to you what the power spectrum basically means. So the power spectrum is basically one side you have something called the frequency, and the other side you basically have an intensity. So here you would have a frequency. Okay, so this is your frequency, and this side you basically would have intensity. Okay, so and then it keeps varying like as you go along, and then you get something like this. Okay, so that's like how your power spectrum looks like. Okay, so now you would directly know what the answer is because it's like a random noise generator. Okay, so it's aperiodic. Okay, the amplitude varies randomly, so this is basically all of the above. Okay, so the random noise generator is mainly used for testing of various systems. The random noise generator contains an aperiodic signal, hence the output spectrum of your random noise generator cannot give a unique signal. So that's why the third option is kind of like ruled out, because it cannot give a unique signal. It basically has an unpredicted power spectrum. And let's look at this. Okay, so what does it do? It basically shows you the strength of the variations energy or your intensity as a function of your frequency. Okay, so this is the basic idea about that question. Now let's look at this. Okay, so this basically involves a lot of statistics, and there are terminologies that come into play, where some things like the null hypothesis and things like just a second, let me just recall the name. Yeah, okay, so these are called the null hypothesis and your alternative hypothesis. Okay, so this is a very simple question. The idea is they want to look at the level of significance. Okay, so you'll automatically go and tick this. Okay, the answer is correct. Okay, you'll automatically go and tick 5. But I want to like explain what this value means, this p-value, and what actually your level of significance means. So basically, when you're doing certain studies, okay, so people keep trying to look at the dependence of one variable and look at the dependence of one variable with respect to another. Okay, so you have a dependent variable and you have an independent variable. So when you're doing such studies, what's going to basically happen is they're going to look at if that study is valid. Okay, so if that study that you have done, is it based on randomness that happens, or is it actually valid? Okay, so let's just look at that. Okay, so you just multiply this by 100 and you end up getting 5%. But let's just look at this. So when you perform a statistical test, a p-value helps you determine the significance of your results in relation to the null hypothesis. Now, what does your null hypothesis tell you? There is no relationship between two variables being studied. One variable does not affect the other. It states that the results are due to chance and not significant in terms of the supporting idea being investigated. So what basically the null hypothesis does is tell you that your study is not correct and is because of randomness that you got it. Okay, so here basically you have something called the p-value, which is basically between your 0 and your 1. So the smaller the p-value, the stronger the evidence that you should reject your null hypothesis. So that does not mean rejecting the study. Okay, you're basically taking into consideration the study. It means rejecting that the null hypothesis does not work here. My study is not based on randomness is what it means. Okay, so this is nothing to do with whether the study is valid or things like that. The study is basically looking at, is the study based on randomness? Okay, that's the only thing you're looking at, but this does not mean that the study you've done is basically correct. Okay, so is it dependent on your randomness is what they're looking at. So a value less than 0.05 is statistically significant. It indicates that the strong evidence against your null hypothesis, as there is a less than 5% chance that the probability that null is correct. Okay, so your results are not random. Okay, but it does not mean that your results are correct. Okay, so now let's look at this. Okay, so this has something to do with the chi-square distribution, which you should have learned in your experimental techniques in physics class. Okay, so this is asking you for your mean and variance of a chi-square distribution with 8 degrees of freedom R. Okay, so you have to look at a couple of properties of chi-square distribution. So what have they told you? They've told you about this. They've told you this. They've told you about the 8 degrees of freedom that there is. Okay. So like, let's look at the properties that your chi-square distribution has. The mean of the distribution is equal to the number of degrees of freedom. So you have mu is equal to V, which implies that mu is equal to 8. Okay. So you've got the mean, which is equal to the degrees of freedom. So here, what you can do is, you know that it's between option 1 and 2. Okay, so the mean that they've asked is the number of degrees of freedom, which is 8. The next thing that they've done is basically the variance of the two variance is equal to 2 times the number of degrees of freedom. So you have sigma square, the variance is equal to 2 times your degrees of freedom. Your degrees of freedom is represented as B. So sigma squared is equal to 2 times 8, which is 16. So you end up knowing that this is your answer. But I would like to go ahead and discuss a couple of things about the chi-square distribution and its properties. So when the degrees of freedom are greater than or equal to 2, the maximum value of y is basically a probability distribution function, which I will show you later, occurs when your chi-square is equal to v minus 2. So the maximum value of y, the probability distribution function, is when the value of your chi-square, which I will show you too, how the value of your chi-square is defined, is equal to v minus 2. So as the degrees of freedom increase, the chi-square curve approaches your normal distribution. Okay, so basically, let's look at the chi-square statistic. Okay, so statistic basically means a variable that depends on a set of numerical data. Okay, so let's look at this. If we select a random sample size n from a normal population having a standard deviation equal to sigma, we find that the standard deviation in our sample is equal to S. Okay, so the standard deviation is given by S, and then what do? Okay, we can calculate this, your chi-square statistics, as n minus 1, n is the size of your sample, into S square. Okay, so that is the standard deviation divided by sigma square. Okay, so basically there are two things that are involved here. Okay, so we select a random sample size n from a normal population having a standard deviation sigma. Okay, and then we find that in our sample that we have your standard deviation equal to S. So there are two standard deviations. One is in our sample and the other one is in your standard normal population. Okay, a random sample that they've taken. Okay, so now let's look at this. The distribution of the chi-square statistic is called the chi-square distribution. The chi-square distribution is defined like this. Okay, so y is basically the probability density function. Y naught chi-square. Y naught is a function of chi-square v power 1 by 2 minus 1. Okay, so chi-square whole power v by 2 minus 1. So v is basically your the number of degrees of freedom that you have. And this is your exponential minus chi-square divided by 2. Okay, so let's look at this. This is your y naught, which depends on the number of degrees of freedom. And chi-square is the chi-square statistic. Then you have the number of degrees of freedom. Okay, and you have your E, which is given us 2.71828. Okay, so you know that. And then you have y naught, which is defined so that the area under your chi-square is basically going to be equal to 1. Okay, so now this is quite a simple question. If you remember how to add your angular momentum. Okay, so for a hydrogen atom in the p state, okay, the values of J are. So basically, I think a lot of people make a mistake in actually calculating these J values. Okay, so there are two things that here you need to note. You're not calculating J square. Okay, so J square, if you have to calculate your J square psi, basically you have J into J plus 1 into h cross square and all that. So that's not what you're calculating. Leave that out of the equation. What you're calculating is the value of little j. So how do you add them up? Okay, so what you need to do is you need to take your J max, okay, which is basically equal to L max. Okay, so since this is just your hydrogen system, we can ignore your maximum values of the L, and then you have your S max. Okay, so this is basically S max that you have. What about your J min? Okay, so you take the modulus of L min minus S min. Okay, so they've given you that this atom is in the p state. Okay, they haven't said electrons. If it's electrons, then you have to calculate your set of L's and your set of S. Here they've just said the hydrogen atom is in the p state. So what does your p state refer to? Your p state basically refers to L equal to 1. S state is L equal to 0. This is your S state. So p state is L equal to 1. So let's keep it there. Okay, so let's just take L equal to 1. Okay, and let's take the spin to be half. Okay, the spin is usually half. So let's take the spin to be half. So you have an L plus S, which is equal to your J max. And that is equal to 1 plus 1 by 2, which should give you a 3 by 2. And what is your J min? Okay, this is how you add angular momentum. You take a modulus of S minus S. This is where a lot of people make mistakes. Okay, they forgot to take the modulus, or they just stop it with this. Okay, so this you have to be careful. You end up having this with a modulus. So that should give you a 1/2. Okay, so also what you can do is you can rule out the other possibilities because you have a modulus sign. Okay, so if you have a negative sign, you can rule all of them out because you do not get a negative sign in this kind of a situation here. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Okay, so your basic principle is the addition of angular momentum. We're supposed to add both the orbital as well as the spin angular momentum. Okay, here you know that your P state L is equal to 1, and this is how you add them up. Okay, so that's what I just explained, right? So which of the photoelectric transducers is used for the production of electric energy by converting solar energy? Okay, so you've done this experiment, I think, in the first sem, where you, first or second sem, I'm not sure, where you basically end up using a photodiode to kind of like put a bulb in front of it and then, you know, put it onto this photodiode. You basically put a bulb in front of it, put it onto the photodiode, and then basically produce electricity. Okay. So, and then you basically get a voltage difference. So you kind of like measure that and say, okay, fine, it's kind of like working. Okay, so let's look at this. Which of the photoelectric transducers is used for the production of electric energy by converting solar energy? So this is a photoemissive cell that they've given, photodiode, photoresistive cell, and photoconductive cell. So let's go through all these options. Okay, you know it's the photodiode, but let's just go through it. Okay, so why the photodiode? Okay, because all of these other things basically do not produce electricity. This is the only thing that gives you electricity. Okay, so it's option B. Now let's look at a photoemissive cell. So basically it's something that's filled with a gas and you emit light on it, and then it kind of like reacts when your light comes on top of it, but it does not produce electricity. So that's a key point here. Okay, so now let's look at photodiode. It's a semiconductor device that converts light into an electric current. The current is generated when the photons are absorbed into the photodiode. The next thing that you have is a photoresistor. Okay, so this is a peculiar kind of resistor. What happens is you kind of like emit light onto it, and then it kind of, the resistance kind of like drops. Okay, so it's like a light decreasing resistance. Okay, and there's another thing that's kind of like based on this called the photoconductive cell, which is kind of like based on the same concept. It's actually you could say the photoresistor is like a type of a photoconductive cell. So the conductance is basically going to be varied when your light falls onto this photoconductive cell. So that's the summary of those whole set of terms. Okay, so now let's look at this question. Be a little careful about this because it involves something called the block function. You have done this in BSc, like a little bit of it, but I don't think people have kind of like registered, you know, the block wave function is this way, kind of a stuff. Okay, so this involves a little bit of a different variant of the block function, something that looks into a different kind of space. Okay, so you're not looking at the direct space, you're looking at a different space, which I will explain right now. So what does this describe? Okay, so here what you're basically getting is, okay, so your K is basically your wave vector. Okay, G is basically another kind of vector, which I will talk to you about. And this is your E eigenvalues of those particular functions. Okay, so eigenvalue of psi kg of R, and this is the eigenvalue of psi k. Okay, so it describes what? The periodic nature of the block functions and their eigenvalues in a reciprocal lattice respectively, the periodic nature of block functions and their eigenvalues in direct lattice respectively, orthogonality nature of your block functions and their eigenvalues, orthonormality nature of your block functions and their eigenvalues. So let's look at what Bloch's theorem is basically based on. Okay, so when you're looking at the eigenfunctions of your infinite crystal, okay, so basically you end up having something like this. Let me just write down. You're looking at a system where you have a periodic potential. So you have something like, say, V of some quantity, say X is equal to V of X plus, let's say, X prime. Okay, so the potential is basically periodic. So at an interval of x, it's going to be the same. Okay. So in such a system, you end up having functions like these. Okay. So the solution of your single electron Hamiltonian were shown to be block wave form of this kind of a form. So here your n is basically a discrete number. Okay. In that unit lattice, if you look at it, you basically end up having n vectors that you multiply along this unit lattice. Okay, so you basically end up having, if you're having some kind of a lattice, let's say something that you have here is n. So you're looking at a periodic nature at that section. So it's like a discrete quantity n. Okay. Now your u of n k r vector is equal to e to the power of I k r, which is again your wave vector, f n k r vector. Okay, so this is how the solutions are defined. Okay, it's like a block wave. Okay. Now, what does your block theorem basically give you? The eigenfunctions of the Hamiltonian can be chosen such that with each eigenfunction u n k is associated a wave vector k. Okay, how is it associated? With your u n k r vector plus your capital R, okay, is equal to e to the power of I k r. You've got two vectors now. You've got an r, little r, and you've got a big R. So that entire big R becomes a phase factor, and this remains. Okay, so this is basically showing a equivalent form of your Bloch's theorem. Okay, so now let's look at this. This is the eigenfunction when it is observed at a distance r and differs by a phase factor of e to the power of I k r. Now, what happens in your reciprocal space? Okay, so in your reciprocal space, what you're doing is you have some kind of a vector g, okay, that you're assigning, and this phase factor that you have, okay, here it will be e to the power of I g vector dotted with your r vector, that ends up being 1. Okay, so we're going to assume that in your, we're going to be assuming that in your reciprocal space. Okay, so now what do you do? Okay, let's look at this. So what ends up happening is, if I put that as 1, I'm going to get un of k plus g. R vector is equal to un k of r. Okay, so this form is basically the same thing as here. Okay, you got a psi k of r is equal to psi k of g. And this only happens when? Okay, this only happens when you end up having this in your reciprocal space. Okay. Okay, so that exponential term just becomes equal to unity only when you're in your reciprocal space. So you need to be in your reciprocal lattice in order to be getting this kind of a relation. Then what do? You kind of like realize if these two wave functions are kind of like the same, the eigenvalues are also supposed to be the same. Okay, so that's the next point they're talking about. Okay, so this would lead to identical wave functions. So the wave functions themselves are going to be identical when this happens. So that's kind of like your next relation that you have here. Okay, so you've got a psi k of g of r, and then you've got your ekg is equal to ek. Okay. So now let's move on to the next question that you have. Okay. So let me just tell you a little bit about this DCS theory that you have. Okay, so basically what you're going to end up getting is a lattice. Okay, let's say all of these are positive ions that you have, and now there's an electron that's trying to move through this lattice. Okay, this we are going to, let me just change the color. Okay, so this is basically your electron which is trying to move through the lattice. Okay, so now what's going to be happening is this is trying to move through, it's going to basically collide with this and collide with this, because these things are vibrating themselves. Okay, so these things themselves are kind of like vibrating. All these atoms are vibrating, they're hitting past each other. So when your electron tries to move across through that, it's going to be difficult. Now what happens when you cool them? Okay, so when you cool them, what's going to happen is these guys are going to kind of like stay stagnant. Okay, not extremely stagnant, but almost stagnant. Okay, so what happens then? Okay, when your atom stays stagnant, your electron can kind of like pass through it. Okay, but the electron, when it's kind of like moving through this, okay, when your electron is like kind of moving through this, what happens is there's a certain pull that's going to be created. Okay, it's like some kind of a distortion that's being created, a kind of like an oscillation. Okay, so then you have something called a phonon that's going to be coming into the picture here. So basically, when you're looking at this lattice, this entire thing is like distorted. And so wherever the electron goes, if it's going to go here, these atoms are going to like approach each other, and these are going to move back to their other places. Okay. Now, if you have two electrons, what's going to happen is, if you end up having two electrons that are coming into the picture, what you see is that they kind of like attract and kind of like form a bond. Okay, so you end up having something called a Cooper pair that's going to be formed. Okay, so this Cooper pair, now if you kind of like dissect and look at it, okay, if you kind of like dissect and look at this Cooper pair that's formed, one of them has a spin, let's say plus half. Okay, and one of them has a spin, let's say minus half, so you end up getting something like 0. Now let's just imagine that it is a plus and a plus. Okay, so you end up getting spins of zeros and ones. Now, even though your electrons are called your fermions, what's going to happen is, because they're kind of like paired up, they're going to create a boson. Okay, so this Cooper pair is a boson. Okay, so you have 0 and 1, you have got integral spin, so this Cooper pair kind of like forms like a boson. So now let's look at the question. Okay, so in your BCS theory of superconductivity, the superconductor state formed from pairs of electrons, which is superconductor state is basically happening because of these Cooper pairs. Okay, so which is formed from pairs of electrons, act as how, even though your electrons are fermions, you do not call them fermions when they are paired up together like that. Okay, so when they're paired up together, the Cooper pairs are called bosons, not fermions. Even though their components are fermions, they together form a boson. Okay, so let's look at this. A Cooper pair, or your BCS pair, is a pair of electrons or other fermions bound together at low temperatures in a particular manner. So these electrons have spin half, so they are fermions, but the total spin of a Cooper pair is integer, so it is a composite boson. Now this means what? That the wave functions are symmetric under the particle interchange for a boson. Okay, that's basically a property of a boson. Unlike electrons, multiple Cooper pairs are allowed to kind of like fall into the same state. So that's basically the property of your bosons. If you have bosons, they all can occupy the same state. Okay, so they can reach your low level state. Now, this causes your phenomenon of superconductivity. Okay, so I think you should probably go ahead and look at a couple of YouTube videos for this. Okay, there are so many really nice experiments that are being done. Okay, I think one of them is like putting a superconductor in a Mobius strip. So a Mobius strip is basically, okay, so what you basically do is you take a long sheet of paper, you can make it at home. Okay, so you take a long sheet of paper and then you kind of like twist it. Okay, you twist one edge and then you kind of like join these two ends together. So what you realize is, if you're going to go through a Mobius strip, it's kind of like really hard to draw a Mobius strip. Okay, so let me just try to kind of like, okay, so there's a bend there. Okay, so we are trying to like draw a Mobius strip. It's kind of like really impossible to do, so I'll kind of like draw this in red when it goes underground. Okay, so here what you're going to do is, when you're going to like kind of like travel through this place, what's going to happen is you're going to go under and then you're going to be traveling behind this kind of like a face. So you could probably check out a lot of videos on it. People have made a lot of games where they kind of like make a Mobius strip, a musical note into a Mobius strip, and then they kind of like play it in this instrument, and then it keeps on looping again and again, and you don't have to change anything. Okay, so what happens is, usually when you go to the bottom side of this Mobius strip, you're supposed to be falling down, okay, because of gravity. But what you see is this superconducting magnet kind of like just kind of like slides through it, even under the Mobius strip and on top of it. Okay. So yeah, okay. So this is about Mobius strips, and I told you what happens when your boson is at a very low temperature. What's going to happen is all your bosons kind of like fall into a low state, and that is called your Bose-Einstein condensate. Okay, so when all of them kind of like reaches the lowest state. Okay, so now let's look at the next question. Okay, the value of flux on a superconductor in SI unit is, okay, so these are the values that have been given to you. Now, I don't think we've actually kind of like derived this formula in the experimental techniques in physics class, but this is related to your SQUID. Okay, it's a device that is based on superconductors, so you can probably go and look at it. So I remember learning this quantity when we were talking about SQUIDs. Okay, so let's look at what your basic definition of your magnetic flux is. So when you're talking about flux, you're talking about some vector through an area. Okay, so here we're talking about magnetic flux. So you're talking about the magnetic vector through an area. So what do you have? Okay, so this magnetic flux is denoted by phi. It's threading some contour or loop. Is defined. Okay, so you've got B as your magnetic flux and you've got your S as your loop area. So you take the dot product of both of them and you get up your flux. Now let's look at this. Okay, so when you're looking at a superconducting magnetic flux quantum, you can derive this using your wave equations. Okay, I'm not going into the depths of the derivation, but I'm just going to tell you how to kind of like memorize this quantity in fact. Okay, so look at this. Okay, so superconducting magnetic flux quantum phi naught is equal to h divided by 2e, and this you can calculate. This quantity you can basically calculate. So what is your Weber? Okay, so let's just dissect that. Here, what is the unit of your magnetic field? It's basically Tesla. What is the unit of your area? It's m squared. So Weber is basically, this is called Weber, and it's basically Tesla meter squared. Okay, and it's a combination of the fundamental constants of, you know, your Planck's constant and the electronic charge. Okay, so I don't know if you kind of like, okay, so when you, how do you remember this? Okay, so this is probably going to be very crude. Okay, it's not very it's not a very nice way. Okay, so basically probably some of you might laugh at it, but anyway. Okay, so basically when you're like laughing, okay, you basically say he twice, right? Okay, so remember this, you're saying he twice. Okay, so let's take that twice and divide it by 2. Okay, so you've got a h, you've got a e, and then you've got a 2. Okay, so that's basically you have you kind of like remember the flux quantum. Okay, so I don't know how many of you like kind of like do this, but whenever I kind of like say something like sarcastic laugh, I kind of like say he twice. Okay, even in text messages, this kind of like happens. People kind of say he twice. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so this is one of the discoveries that was associated with your Josephson junctions, which you should have read about in your SQUID. Okay, so basically the principle of your SQUID is based on Josephson junctions. Okay, so that's how you calculate this. And here I've kind of like written Tesla meter squared. And the inverse of this superconducting magnetic flux quantum is basically called a Josephson constant. Okay, and it's called Kj. So let's just look at all aspects of different constants that you can find out with these this superconducting magnetic flux quantum. Okay, so now this is something that you should probably listen to very carefully, because all of these are thermoelectric effects and it's extremely confusing. Okay, so one of them kind of like resembles the other so much that you do not know where your actual points are. Okay, so now these are the different thermoelectric effects. So you have the Joule effect. I'm supposing that they mean the Joule heating effect here. Okay, there are different types of Joule effects, but I'm supposing that because all these Pelcher, Thomson, and Seebeck, all of them come under thermoelectric effects. Okay, so what do you have? Thermal energy and electric. electric energy. So it involves a kind of like a change from one form to the other. Okay, so that's your first basic definition of all these effects. Now, what's going to happen is based on if you supply a current or not, the effects are going to kind of like differ. And this Peltier effect is like extensively used. Okay, so if you're looking at your portable ACs, okay, so if you're looking at portable ACs, or if you're looking at these people who go camping and they have a mini fridge with them, all of that is basically based on your Peltier effect. Now, why don't we use the Peltier effect in your big ACs and things like that? It's that it's not very effective. Okay, so it's not a very effective way to cool large places, but it's kind of okay because the device is so small to kind of like take it, you know, like all these portable devices that you have, you can use this Peltier effect. Okay, so let's look at this. The schematic arrangement shown in your following figure. Let's look at this. Okay, so you have here they've given you a metal A, okay, and here they've given you a metal B, and they've said T1 and T2 are different, and you have your T0 here. Okay, so all of these are different and given to you, and you kind of like connected a voltmeter to it and it's showing a deflection. Okay, so what you're supposed to understand is there is no supply of current here. That's one thing that you have to look at. No current that is passed through this. Okay, but what's going to happen is there is a potential difference created. Okay, a potential difference is created here. Okay, because of what? Because of the difference in temperatures that you have here and here. Okay, so now let's look at each of these. Okay, so now they basically don't, one other thing that I forgot to mention is they basically don't put this Joule effect in thermal electric effects because all of these are reversible. Okay, thermodynamically reversible. Your Peltier, Thomson, and Seebeck are thermodynamically reversible, but your Joule effect is not reversible. So basically people, like, they don't categorize it into this thermoelectric effect sometimes. Okay, but it is something to do with thermal and electric energies, remember that. So your Joule heating effect is basically, you know, your ice losses are like proportional to I square R. So basically when you have these supplies, your electric supplies that you have, if you have a thicker wire, your losses are going to be more. Okay, because the resistance is that much more. Okay, and if your you have a tinier wire, it's going to be lesser. So basically the heat that is going to, it's basically called the Joule heating effect. It's basically talking about the heat that is given out because of the current passing through a wire. Okay, and if you look at it, that's kind of like an irreversible process thermodynamically because you're losing something there. Okay, so let's look at this. The thermoelectric effect is basically the conversion of temperature differences into electric voltage and vice versa via a thermocouple. Okay, so thermoelectric devices basically create a voltage when there is a difference in temperature on each side. When a voltage is applied to it, heat is transferred from one side to another, which creates a temperature difference. And this thermoelectric effect, okay, encompasses three separate effects, basically your Seebeck effect, Peltier effect, and your Thomson effect. And why is it so? Okay, so this, let's look at these two now. So your Seebeck and your Peltier together, basically it's like a combination of this, and it's like an extension of the Peltier-Seebeck model. So why is your Joule heating not a part of this thermoelectric effect? The heat that is generated whenever a current passes through a resistor material is not generally termed a thermoelectric effect. Okay, Peltier, Seebeck, and Thomson are thermodynamically reversible, whereas your Joule heating is not. We've all talked about that. The Seebeck effect is built up of an electric potential across a temperature gradient. A thermocouple measures this difference in your potential across a hot and cold end for two dissimilar materials. Okay, so this potential difference produces a temperature difference between the hot and cold ends and produces a voltage when exposed to heat. So now do you realize what is mentioned in the question? Okay, so there is a temperature difference that is going to be producing a voltage, and that's how you get your Seebeck effect here. Okay, now let's just look at what your Peltier and Thomson mean. Okay, so when an electric current is passed through a circuit of a thermocouple, heat is evolved at one junction and absorbed at the other junction. This is called your Peltier effect. The Peltier effect is the presence of heating or cooling Okay, so what you realize is, I think he kind of like did it with bismuth and another metal, copper. Okay, so when it was passed from copper to bismuth, and your current passed from copper to bismuth, there was heating that was involved, and when it passed the other way from bismuth to copper, there was cooling involved. So basically that's how you kind of like generate these mini fridges that you have, and like all these cases to kind of hold ice when you're traveling along a longer distance. Okay, so that's basically a Peltier effect. Okay, and your Thomson effect, again, there's basically a current that is driven through the temperature gradient. Okay, so there's basically a continuous version of the Peltier effect that's occurring. Okay, so it's the Thomson effect, and there's heating of cooling of that current carrying conductor. Okay, so that's the summary of these thermoelectric effects. Okay, so this is the last question. We've discussed about superfluidity yesterday. So superfluidity is a state of matter in which the matter behaves like a fluid with what? Okay. So in finite viscosity, zero viscosity, high viscosity, and low viscosity, I think we talked about this. I mentioned this yesterday. It's zero viscosity. That's why it's called a superfluid. Okay. So there is zero viscosity, and yeah, I wanted to kind of like show this picture to you. So basically this is a cup with a helium, and what basically you see here is that it's kind of like dripping down. Okay, so they've kind of like shown these experiments where you put this superfluid into this beaker, and it's like the beaker isn't even there. Okay, it's like falling down. Okay, now not just that. Okay, so any liquid that you look at, okay, it has a tendency to climb the walls of the container. Okay, but it's kind of like stopped because of the resistance of the liquid with the container. But when you're looking at this helium, you don't have any resistance at all there, so it kind of like climbs on the edges of it and kind of like comes down. Okay, and if you kind of like put a, if you stir it like you're stirring your coffee with sugar, it kind of like constantly keeps stirring. Okay, so it's like you stir it once and it keeps rotating and forms vortices and things like that. So you can probably check this out. There are interesting videos on this, like this superfluid and things with what you do with that. Okay, so that's it for today. I kind of like run past a lot. There was a lot of statistics and a lot of terminologies that I kind of like had to explain. So yeah, so I don't think there are any things that I have to say. Yeah, if you can fill out the feedback form, that would be really great, because I'm planning to do another set for NET. Okay, so whoever's like interested in doing these, like NET problem solving, I think this is going pretty well. Okay, so that's the feedback I've like received from most of the juniors. Like it's going pretty well, and we're learning a lot while we're doing this and stuff. So yeah, so I want to start another kind of like study session for NET. And if you're interested, kind of like fill that form and kind of like put your opinions down there, because it's really something that I need to look into, like if it's possible and things like that.